Good afternoon, friends and American Society for the Positive Care of Children community. Welcome to A Better Future Starts Here, a live weekly show brought to you by American SPCC. I'm your host, Tracy Kawa. American SPCC is dedicated to improving the lives of children in the United States. We are America's voice for children, bringing individuals and organizations to you to ensure that children are raised in a safe environment so that they may thrive to become healthy, secure future leaders of tomorrow. Our goal is to bring you industry perspective, knowledge, and support from the experts and professionals who are dedicated to empowering children and families. Today, we are so happy to bring you Maryann Samreth here to talk about becoming yourself through writing. Thank you for joining us, Maryann.
Hi, Tracy. Thank you so much for having me. I am so excited to be here.
We're excited to have you. I want to read a little bit about your bio. Maryann Samreth is a trauma writing coach, helping people write their trauma stories, heal through the process, and reclaim their power. She has published over 100 poems and personal essays online and has reached over 1 million people with her stories through her memoir podcast, Mental Breakthrough. She is the founder of Sincerely Miss Mary, where she hosts group courses for trauma writing. And she has an upcoming trauma writing course coming out, I think, next week. So we're really excited to have you here. Thank you for joining us to discuss emotional flashbacks and becoming yourself through writing. You're doing some really amazing work, Maryann. I've personally witnessed the fact how therapeutic writing can be. So can you tell us how you got involved with trauma writing?
Yeah, so trauma writing was something I did in my personal experience and how it helped me move forward from trauma experiences. So my story begins from having a PTSD episode when I was 27 and didn't even realize it was PTSD at the time. I had really suppressed a lot of things that happened in my life. So from there, this was about 2017, where therapy was not as talked about as it is now with Gen Z and millennials talking about mental health. It was something that I sought when I was 27. And in therapy, my therapist told me to start journaling on my iPhone because it was always accessible to me. I was at a point in my life where I was just in the deepest state of depression and have had all of these experiences that I just suppressed, that I wasn't honest with myself, with everyone around me. I wasn't telling anyone what I was going through. So writing my emotions really allowed me to be honest with myself. And that's where my writing journey began. I began writing the emotional truths of my reality because I was in a very psychologically manipulative, abusive relationship. What had happened was that my ex at the time, and trigger warning, his best friend sexually assaulted me 4 years prior. And when I told my partner at the time, he victim shamed me back into silence for over a year and a half. And that's when my writing was kind of my tool for survival. I needed a place to be real with my emotion because at the time, I didn't really have that anyone I could be real with. I was just a huge people pleaser. I had mastered this facade of like this New York City girl working in fashion, being in her 20s, living in the Upper East Side. Like I felt like I was wrong to have anything wrong with me in my life. So writing what was happening to me, the abuse that I was going through, was my safe place. It was a place for me to be safe. And over a year and a half, I was writing every single day, just live journaling the truths of my experience and living two different realities, which is really crazy to think about now, that I was showing up in two different ways. Like, I made Sincerely Miss Mary. It was an anonymous Instagram account. I was real, 100% real on Instagram. Didn't tell anyone about that. And then in my reality, I was just this perfect person that was smiling, that was the person everyone, needed me to be, to make them feel good about themselves. That's how I felt like I had this role to just be that people pleaser. And eventually I wrote in such a way in my anonymous Instagram account in a perspective of standing up for myself that I became that person and eventually was able to get out of that relationship, that really toxic relationship, and continue writing. So I continued writing poetry. I started writing personal essays. And eventually this became my passion because I was a designer at Tommy Hilfiger at the time, but I was writing behind the scenes. I was going to open mics around New York City, like designing bags during the day, at night, going to open mics. Like I felt like Batman. Like it was just,
that's awesome.
It was two different worlds. And eventually during the pandemic, I decided, like to just pursue writing full time. So I eventually left, and then I created a podcast called Mental Breakthrough where I write 20 trauma scripts. I tell my story of how I healed through writing, which is an amazing process, and how I reconnected with my Cambodian heritage, because I am Cambodian. My parents escaped the genocide, which is a huge part of, I feel like my writing channels like the ancestors that were lost during the genocide. And within the creation of this podcast, I really wanted to teach this process of trauma writing. And I coincidentally met trauma-informed psychotherapists and ancestral life coaches that helped me connect the dots as to what I was doing and made me realize that what I was doing was a modality that they teach. And I didn't know I was doing this without anyone guiding me. It was just intuition. And so realizing that this is a process that psychotherapists use and life coaches use, I was just like, this is wild. Like I have to put together a program and teach people how to do the same, because my story is wild and it's extraordinary, but I think we all are extraordinary. I think we all have these individual experiences that make us extraordinary, and we deserve to tell our story. So all of everything that I went through, how I got into trauma writing, led me to become a coach and teach people this process that I learned intuitively. And now I just want to educate everyone about trauma, because there's not as much education about trauma as there should be. And I think it's not as daunting when we educate ourselves about it. We can learn so much about ourselves and just break that shame cycle.
Yeah. I think it's so important not just to tell our stories, but to acknowledge our stories, to own our stories, not to allow anybody to alter our own reality when we know what our story is, but yet there's someone else telling, no, that didn't happen, and it didn't happen like that. Well, I know my story, and yes, it did happen. So I really acknowledge you, because that can be a very dark place, and it takes a lot of courage to stand up and say, no, this is my story. This is what happened to me. And now I'm going to tell it. And, even if someone starts out writing under a pen name, they eventually get to own it as you did. And bravo for you for coming into that place where you stepped out of one creative field at Tommy Hilfiger and right into another one that felt even more authentic to who you are. And I applaud you for that.
Thank you. And I was just thinking about today how like a lot of writers come to me and they're afraid to write their story. And I tell them, I'm like, you can be anonymous. I was anonymous for 1.5 years. Like it's all about that like practice of putting that movement of writing your story onto paper, where you actually start to embody that person that has the confidence to write their story. Because that's exactly what happened to me. Like the way I was showing up during that time, like no one knew I was writing. I was not honest with anyone in my life what I was going through. I was suppressing so much trauma that had happened to me in my 20s, not just from the sexual assault, not just from that abusive relationship, but things that happened when I worked at certain abusive fashion environments that I was, not telling anyone what was happening. And I started writing and just practicing that muscle movement of really just advocacy. Trauma writing is writing the truth of your experiences. That's advocacy, and we need more of that in the world. So that's why I love guiding people through this process, because I'm just teaching them to be their own advocates. Like they matter, their stories matter, their experiences matter. And through that process, like they can heal and just become the person they are meant to be. And that's all I want, is just everyone to feel safe being themselves in the world.
Muscle movement of advocacy. I love that. I love that. So tell us a little bit about trauma, because we all have a different view of what we think trauma is. And you've mentioned previous conversations, you've mentioned to me about small traumas, large traumas. Can you clarify what trauma actually is?
Yeah. So I actually didn't really know what it was until I met one of my friends who's a creative arts therapist. And I was in a talk with her, and she gave the true definition of trauma. And it's having a reaction to an overwhelming experience. It's not the event itself, which is so fascinating. Like, I always thought it was the event itself, but it's the reaction to an overwhelming event, which is why every single trauma that each person experiences matters, because we all have different reactions. None of us have the same reaction to an event. So like a little T trauma, I think the easiest example is the pandemic. That was an overwhelming event we all had, and every person had a different coping mechanism. Like some people, chose to write like me. Some people baked banana bread to cope in a healthy way. Like some people just denied it. And I think like the pandemic is a good example of like, those little T traumas, but also like the big T trauma is like having someone that passed away from COVID. That is a big T trauma. And having all of those experiences shape the way we cope with it. And we all have a different coping mechanism. And the 4 trauma responses are flight, freeze, fawn, and fight. And those responses can create different coping mechanisms. So for me, I would say an example would be the fashion industry. That caused me to have a flight trauma response. So right now, like I burn out. Like workaholism is a type of trauma response, as a type of coping mechanism from a flight trauma response. It's just going. And like a big T example would be like, I'll talk about the sexual assault. When it happened, I froze. I did not move during that time. And the way that it affected me afterwards was numbing. So I would be drinking a lot, like in my 20s, to suppress all of that emotion. I would, just avoid, I just did not want to deal with those emotions. So I would find ways to just numb myself, not to think about it. So those are just examples of experiences I've had when I've had trauma, and different ways of coping with it. And some ways are obviously healthy, like writing is a healthy coping mechanism. Some are unhealthy, like drinking, substance abuse. And the thing is like our body and our mind is trying to protect ourselves when we're coping. That's why it's called coping. And when we recognize that this is what trauma does to us, and this is how we responded because of this way, it helps us break that shame cycle. Because with trauma, you can often get stuck shaming your past self. I know that happened a lot with me, like shaming the moments where I was just silent and taking all that, abuse from my ex-partner. Educating yourself about trauma and these coping mechanisms will break the shame cycle. And I think that's, really the biggest thing that we need to do to move forward from experiences that causes trauma.
Yeah. I'd like to take a little bit of a deeper dive into each of these unhealthy coping mechanisms, and just have you explain briefly what each one is, if you don't mind. So the freeze trauma response would be what?
Yeah, so freeze would be numbing. So like I talked about, having an addiction to ways to avoid having an avoidant personality, where you could be in like a social situation and just be really, really quiet and not engage. It could be disassociation, where you're not really present. So I feel like mindfulness comes into mind when you are trying to help a freeze trauma response, just staying present, staying grounded, asking yourself, like, where are you right now? Like, are you safe? Like, are you here? Like, maybe you have to say, like, like small things to remind yourself that you're present. Like, I'm Maryann, I am 31, I am in my home. So like just being more mindful will help with that.
Right, confirming, being mindful, being present. And then what about fight trauma response? What is that?
Yeah, so this would be bullying. So like people with narcissistic traits, like projecting their unhealed wounds onto others, and a lot of I would say, like, taking your anger out on others, which is what a lot of us do if we refuse to look within. So people with high traits of narcissism that bully others that is a fight trauma response, and that's something I experience in the fashion industry. There's a lot of like abusive female leaders, which is something that no one talks about, but a lot of, I see that because I've psychoanalyzed my experience in the fashion industry. I see that as having like a fight trauma response from whatever they went through in the past, that they feel safe to bully others.
And then the next would be the flight trauma response.
Yeah, so this is something that I'm still working through right now. It's workaholism. So just like constantly working, burning out, and on the go. So like when you constantly have to keep yourself busy and not avoid, the inner work of whatever you're trying to work through, that burning out is an example of a flight trauma response.
And then the fawn trauma response would be?
So that would be people pleasing. And so actually, an example I did that a lot when the man that sexually assaulted me, because he was my old partner's best friend, I people pleased him. I wanted him to like me so I could feel in control. So with that experience, I was just trying to get him to be on my side so he wouldn't hurt me again. So all of these things, like, some of us we're unconscious to it. We don't really realize that we're doing it because we're really doing it trying to protect ourselves, and that's why it happens. And when you learn that, you develop these coping mechanisms, like people pleasing. Like, no one wants to be a people pleaser. We shame ourselves when we do it, but at the end of the day, like, it is you trying to protect yourself, and like having that awareness, that's where it comes from. You're able to change it.
So now that we've gone through some of the unhealthy coping mechanisms, let's talk about the good stuff. Let's talk about the healthy coping mechanisms. So what are some of the ways to regulate yourself emotionally via healthy mechanisms?
Yeah, so creativity is a big one. Like, you see, like, musicians, songwriters, artists, and for me, it's writing. I believe that, it's actually psychology. Like, creativity helps us move forward from trauma, and that's because we need to channel outwards a way where we can just be completely ourselves without judgment. And so that's why for me it's writing, because when I'm writing, the process is just for me, and I can be 100% authentic, honest, and just be me. And that's why creativity is so important. Like, with an artist, like, you don't hold back when you're painting or you're drawing. You don't hold back when Taylor Swift doesn't hold back when she's writing like a love song or a breakup song, like, it's channeling creativity as a way to express our innermost desires. I feel like the basic human desire is to just feel like we belong, and we are able to do that ourselves and regulate our own emotions by tapping into the most creative parts of our lives, which could be whatever you choose to be. For me, it's writing. For you, it could be, maybe it's drawing or knitting or something creative, something where you can just fully enjoy it and be you.
Do you feel that everybody has a creative channel that they can tap into?
Oh yeah, I think so. It's just letting yourself do something that you enjoy. And I think, like when we're kids, we have recess. That's creativity, is playing. Like that that is where you can be yourself, let yourself be free, and just surrender to whatever your desire is when you're a kid. Maybe it's like running till you're out of breath, or like throwing a football or something. But creativity is just a way to really just express ourselves in a way where we can truly be free and not judge ourselves. So creativity is so important. And I think that having curiosity about that, if you don't know what your creative flow is, just be curious and try everything. This is a place for you to be you. So explore it.
Yeah. And express yourself, get all of those negative emotions out, the negative thoughts that maybe play like an endless loop inside your head, which, speaking of which, so post-traumatic stress disorder. Can we talk about that for a minute? Because from what I understand, there are different types of PTSD. Can you explain them?
Yeah, so something that I just learned about is complex PTSD, which I have PTSD and complex PTSD. I have both. So complex PTSD could be something that doesn't cause you physical harm, but it still affects the way you move through adulthood. So an example would be child abuse, like emotional, verbal gaslighting, prolonged child abuse when you're a kid. Maybe you weren't physically harmed, but maybe you saw your parents fighting every day until you were 12. That's going to cause you complex PTSD. That's going to create maybe you have like an anxious attachment style, which is you being, anxious of any kind of like romantic relationships. So having complex PTSD, it's encompassing, those experiences you had as a child and how it affects you into adulthood. Whereas PTSD is more like a common thing people, know about, like war or sexual assault or an event where your life is physically in danger. And that can also affect the way you grow up now. So like some of the things that have happened to me, like when I had a PTSD attack, an episode, we'll call an episode, at 27, I was experiencing all of the emotions I had then in the same way that when it happened, because trauma stays in your body and your body can't differentiate time. So you're going to be experiencing it in the same way as when it happened, and your body does not know that you're not back in that dangerous place. It just thinks you're in it now. So when that was happening to me, I remember feeling so unsafe. Like I felt like my life was in danger. I didn't even know what was happening. I didn't realize till like I started going to therapy that it was PTSD. It was an episode, but I remember just feeling so scared, like I was going to die. And it was the same experience I had when I had the PTSD event happen. So hopefully that helps to explain what PTSD is versus complex PTSD. I think complex PTSD is still pretty new to me. It's something that I'm still learning about. And I think educating yourself on both of these and learning how it kind of shaped how you have developed relationships with other people is important to recognize. And if you're showing up to certain relationships in an unhealthy way, you can be aware of it and shift your mind, like go to therapy, get help to develop a safe relationship within yourself. Everything can be healed. So like these things, PTSD, complex PTSD, child abuse, doesn't define you. It does not define you, because those are traumas, and traumas is having an experience of trauma is never your fault.
So that's so true. It's, how we experience it, and trauma is, your reaction, a person's reaction to an event, which I always thought it was the event itself. And I'm sure that many of us think that. So thank you for, highlighting that. And what I find really interesting is the fact that our bodies can't differentiate whether the trauma is, or whether the event is actually happening now, or if we're just reliving it. So interesting. And very important to take note of that, because like you said, when you were experiencing it, you didn't know why you were experiencing that all of a sudden and what was happening. So it's great that you sought treatment and therapy for it. Can you tell us the types of therapy that have helped you?
Yeah, I've done so many. When you're healing trauma, it's a cocktail of mind, body, and spirit. It is everything. And you're allowed to choose. You don't have to do traditional talk therapy. I'll talk about what I've done. I have been in trauma-informed cognitive behavioral therapy for almost 4 years. And that is traditionally talk therapy, where they help you reframe your mindset around events so you can build a relationship with yourself and always feel like you're in control. Because with complex PTSD, I always felt like I was not in control. So I would have these like unhealthy coping mechanisms to feel like I was in control, like people pleasing. That was me feeling like if I made this person happy, I'm in control, I'm safe. So it really in that kind of therapy, it really broke down all of my behaviors and made me realize that like I actually do have a lot of power within me. I can be my own advocate. I can say no. That was a big like breakthrough for me, like huge. Giving myself permission to say no. That was huge. So I've done that with PTSD. I have done hypnotherapy. I've done it 3 times, and that is an experience where the person that I worked with, she took me back to that experience of when the trauma happened and helped me reframe it and witness it so I can realize like, oh, that wasn't my fault. Like I didn't deserve that. So I've done hypnotherapy for PTSD. I'm a huge runner. So like somatic healing is also important. That's, working with your body. So like yoga is really important. I've done yoga. Doing physical activity is like a great way for you to release like those trauma that is stuck in your body, doing breath work. So those are things that I've done, but now there's so many different types of therapies you can do. Like my friend's a psychodrama therapist. So she teaches people like, theater, drama, narratives, metaphors to deal with trauma. I have another friend who is an eco art feminist therapist where she helps people connect with earth and nature. So there is so many different types of therapies that you can tap into. And it's amazing to see how much more is accessible now, especially like with social media. You can literally go on Instagram and be like, oh, there's a breathwork coach. There's a self-love embodiment coach. There's so many different types of healing modalities that we can now access. And it's just choosing which one that, suits you, that you are drawn to, and it's okay. Like you don't have to do what I'm doing. Like do what you think is going to work for you.
Absolutely. So for the people who are just joining on now, I just want to reset the room a little bit. We're here with Maryann Samreth, and we're talking about healing through writing and post-traumatic stress and trauma and how that can be healed through different therapies, one of which is writing therapy, and she's a writing coach. So actually, you were just talking about drama therapy, and in the past, we've had Heidi Landis on our show, and she's coming back in a couple of
weeks. She was one of my co-leads for my first round of my writing program. Yeah.
That is awesome.
That's so funny.
Know that, but I
didn't know that. I'm just learning that now. That's awesome.
For our upcoming episode in a couple of weeks, because she's coming back. She just went out on her own, launched her own practice full time. So we're excited to have her back on the show. Mm-hmm. So getting back to how you help through your writing, what are some of the ways that you help both men and women, I believe, right?
Mm-hmm.
Women through writing.
Yeah. So I take them through the process that I did myself, that I have now psychoanalyzed with trauma-informed therapists and ancestral healers. And it's an immersive experience where you connect your mind, body, and spirit with the writing process. So I teach my class that I teach. My second round is starting next week, which I'm very excited about. I basically encompass everything. So like things I've learned in therapy, like one of the first things in therapy is permission to feel your feelings and emotional regulation. And it actually takes psychology fact, a 90 seconds to regulate your emotion. If you just sit in the feeling of discomfort, you will feel better. So I teach how to do that with writing, and how you really just write your feelings down, and it can be as ugly or as beautiful as you want it to be. So I teach that. That's a part of it. I have co-leads that come in to help me facilitate this process. There's also a spiritual aspect, because I think I mentioned that I reconnected with my Cambodian ancestors through writing.
Yeah.
I know it sounds woo-woo, but I had no writing experience before I was a trauma writer. Before I started writing, I hated writing in college. I would try to bribe friends to do my papers. So I really believe that there are we have creativity in our ancestry lines. Like there's someone that in our past that was a writer, and for me, that's what I discovered when I was on this journey of writing. I discovered that my great uncle was a famous writer in Cambodia, and he was an ambassador. And my grandpa, who survived the genocide but died very quickly, he was a community builder. And my oldest aunt that I never got to meet because she passed away, she was a storyteller. So I encompass all of their gifts that they handed to me, and became a voice for them because they weren't able to do that in their lifetime. So there is a spiritual aspect where we learn to connect with our ancestors. We also do embodiment healing, where we tap into our bodies and we channel, where that emotion is, where that trauma lies, where that fear is. And we encompass that into writing. And then the most important part of the class is what everyone wants to learn, is how to share their writing without fear of judgment. And so that's one of the big things that I teach in this class, is how to navigate fear of judgment when you share your story, because it's a completely different mindset. You will get hate. That's a part of it. I've learned that when I grew my influencer platform on TikTok. It's just part of it. Getting criticism and judgment, it's a part of it. But from the most part, maybe 1% you get hate and criticism. It just amplifies when you get it, because that's what we're taught to focus on. But for the most part, when you are ready to share your story, it reaches people that will resonate and will feel less alone. So that's what I teach, is having that mindset shift of just letting go when you're ready to share your story. And when you put it out in the world, just trusting that it will reach people that need your words, and have an experience where they too have that experience, and they feel validated in you writing your story. And then maybe it gives them the courage to write their story. So it's like that ripple effect. So the process that I teach, it's everything. It encompasses mind, body, and spirit. And you come out of this class being a writer, and also learning to be your own advocate and showing up to the world in the most authentic way, because the way you write on paper, it really translate how you show up to the world. It's what happened with me. If you were to meet me before I was writing, you would have met a completely different person. But I've transformed my trauma through the writing process, and I'm more myself than I've ever been. And that's what I want people to feel when they come out of my writing program.
That's incredible, because one can go into a writing course and come out with a great article or manuscript or even a book, but it's the transformational process behind the writing that you really hold a lot of weight to.
Yeah, exactly.
And I love that spiritual aspect of tapping into your ancestors, because how much do we really know about our ancestors? But tapping into it can be so powerful, just to exponentially give us purpose of why we're here on earth, and why did we go through what we went through, in order to put a voice to it and exponentially optimize it so that we can deliver it to others. And for that 1% of the population that might have something negative to say, when you're posting on social media, there's that 99% that is resonating with you. And that's why they're coming back for more and listening. Mm-hmm. And I so admire the work that you're doing. If somebody wanted to participate in your writing mastermind, your writing workshop, I'm just going to flash your website across. That's where they go to, right?
Yeah.
Mary?
Go to my website. You can DM me on Instagram today. This is the last week I'm taking interviews for this program. So DM me today that you want to be a part of this, and then I can get you enrolled. And we start next week on Wednesday.
You could step into your writing power as early as a week from today. That's huge. That's huge. Couple of last questions for you. So how can our listeners make a difference, both within their homes and outside of their homes?
Yeah, so I would say be honest with yourself. With whatever you're experiencing, be honest with the way it makes you feel, because you're always valid in the way you feel from an experience. A lot of us go through life with this desire to just belong, and then we encounter people that make us feel otherwise. And it's okay to grieve that process of unbelonging if you had an experience like that, whether it's at work, with a partner, with a friend. Like, I think the most healthy way to honor ourselves, to be ourselves in this world, is to just be honest with the truth of our experiences, even with the most uncomfortable parts, because it's that uncomfortable parts where we learn what nourishes us, and then giving ourselves permission to move towards places that nourish us, and setting boundaries and being our own advocates. So I would say, be your own advocate today with yourself. And if you have kids, like, teach them how to be their own advocates. Teach them that, like, saying no is powerful, and like being yourself is the bravest thing that you can do. So I would say the power of advocacy, and the power of advocacy paves way for you to be free to be yourself.
That's great. It's great. And it's all about empowering ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
And when you said that we want to belong, it made me think that we all want to belong, so we make ourselves wrong. And then it's a lifelong journey getting back to right.
Yeah.
Getting back to making it okay to be who we actually are.
Yeah. There's this quote I saw, like, a clip of Brene Brown talking about how we have this pressure to fit in, where we want to belong. She talks about how belonging is just being ourselves and seeing who we attract, whereas, like, fitting in is molding ourselves to be a certain way to see who we attract. And that's just trying to fit in does the opposite. We don't feel like we belong if we're molding ourselves to be a certain way to be liked. It's much more freeing to just be you and see who you attract.
Yes. It's much more authentic.
Mm-hmm.
So in wrapping this all up, can you just run by us one more time about how children can regulate their emotions, and, how boundaries pertain to children, and just some last bits of advice?
Yeah, so this is a topic that I'm very, very passionate about, is educating children on emotional regulation. And what I would love to see more of is having emotional regulation, mental health, or advocacy classes for these kids, starting from when they're in school, from elementary school, and teaching them how to be the advocates for their lives. Because unfortunately, which I learned from reading this psychology book called Body Keeps the Score about trauma, is that child abuse is a hidden epidemic. And that's because we can't control what goes on in a child's home. It's unfortunate, but that is the truth. But what we can do is teach them mental health tools, mindset tools, emotional regulation, teaching them how to say no, teaching them how to protect themselves and be their own advocates from a kid, so they don't grow up trying to repeat their traumas in their adulthood, which is what I've done. A lot of people I know have done, where we try to recreate what happened in our childhood and master that trauma. So I want to avoid that. I don't want any kids going through what I went through in my 20s. And I think the only way is to incorporate education programs into the schools. Like, maybe we pass a bill or something, but that's something that right now I am working on with a friend, is creating programs and pitching it to schools so we can teach people how to regulate their emotion using creativity, writing, breath work, meditation, mindfulness. I really believe in educating, the future leaders. I think it's our responsibility that now that I'm in a place of empowerment, because I've, healed and worked on myself, like it's important for me to pass the torch to prevent anyone else, any kids repeating what I've gone through. I really want to, be the person that my younger self needed. And I think educating kids from an early age will prevent them from, doing what I did, which is really, really messy. But yeah.
Sure. Educating them and teaching them how to handle things as it occurs. Teach them how to handle situations, what to do with the feelings that arise from the trauma. So you really are doing amazing, incredible work in the world. And I thank you on behalf of so many people whose lives you're going to transform and who you're going to help, mentally, physically, emotionally, in all ways. So thank you, Maryann. And we'd love to have you back on the show in a few months when you get your courses off the ground and just to kind of give us an update. We really enjoyed having you today.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me and giving me this space to talk about my story and teach you guys something about trauma.
That's great. Thank you. So I'm going to do a little outro. If you are looking for more resources like this, please visit our Learning Center at AmericanSPCC.org. And don't forget to download the Happy Child app, which is a free and extremely useful parenting app that shows how to connect with your children, build those great chemicals in their brains so that they can have happiness that lasts a lifetime, not just momentarily. And if you know someone like Maryann in your community who's doing some fabulous work to uplift communities, families, kids, please reach out to us at info@AmericanSPCC.org. If you want to reach Maryann, I'm going to flash the website for Sincerely Miss Mary one more time. Again, we appreciate you, Maryann, and thank you for being on our show, making a difference. And remember, everyone, let's make a difference together. Visit us at AmericanSPCC.org to learn how you can help. And remember, a better future starts here.
Thank you.
Thank you.